Hello there, this is Mr. Tavner, and let's get into the Civil War. So, I know that you've read some of the stuff about the Civil War in the earlier packets, and now we're going to get, I guess, a little more into the war itself. Now, first thing I need you to know, the first thing that you really got to understand, the cause of the Civil War. There is really just one cause of the Civil War. It's only one word. It's real simple. The cause of the Civil War was slavery. Yeah, that's the one word, simple answer on the cause of the Civil War. So let's get into talking about the Civil War and a little bit of a comparison. So before the start of the war in 1860, before the election of Lincoln, it was all one country. All of this was all the United States of America. It was all the Union. And then Abraham Lincoln was elected in November. And when Abraham Lincoln was elected in November, 7 states decided to leave the Union and form their own country. South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas all decided to leave the United States and form their own country, the Confederate States of America. Now, the thing is, Lincoln wasn't president yet. He was elected in November, and he doesn't take the oath of office until March. So the first 7 states that seceded, Lincoln wasn't president. The guy who was president when these first 7 states seceded was the worst president ever, James Buchanan. Yeah. While he was president, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas left the country. Now, you can say what you want about any other president of the United States. They're not going to be as bad as James Buchanan because only James Buchanan has let other states leave the country and form their own country. No other president has done that, where they just let that happen. And James Buchanan, yeah, he did that. Now, in April, in fact, on April 12th, thank you for the explosion, April 12th, Fort Sumter, the Confederates, the people of South Carolina, fired on the Union fort at Fort Sumter, which was in the harbor at Charleston. The next day, Fort Sumter surrenders. It was a win for the Confederacy, and was the first shots of the Civil War. Now, the interesting thing with that, the Civil War wound up costing over 600,000 lives. Over 600,000 soldiers wound up dying in the Civil War. In the very first battle of the Civil War at Fort Sumter, nobody died. It was a very unusual battle in that. But yeah, the Civil War was a bloody, awful, awful war. Americans found new and inventive ways of killing each other. It's in the Civil War where you have your first machine guns. It's in the Civil War where you have your first iron-covered warships, iron warships. It's yeah, we really the Americans found some really interesting ways to kill each other. First use of a submarine to sink a warship was during the Civil War. So yeah, it was awfully bloody. But Fort Sumter, nobody died in that battle. Now, after the battle at Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln, he's president by then. Abraham Lincoln wasn't going to let this just kind of happen and go, oh, what's going to, I don't know. No, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to join the army to put down the rebellion, to get these states back into the Union. And when he called for those 75,000 volunteers, there were other states that decided to secede. West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas decided to join the Confederacy instead of having any of their men go and fight against the other states in the South. So you notice that all of these states are all blue. Now, these states stayed in the Union. And every state north of there, going all the way up to Maine, they stayed in the Union. So New Jersey was definitely a Union state. And you notice how Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri are not colored in. And that's because they were border states. These were states that allowed slavery, but there wasn't a definite that they were going to join the Confederacy or not. Well, not really. Delaware was definitely going to stay in the Union. There never was really much question of that. Now, Maryland was definitely a problem. If Maryland joined the Confederacy, that would mean that the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., would be in Confederate territory. So Lincoln didn't want to have that happen. So sent Union soldiers into Maryland. The people of Maryland wound up having a vote, and they decided that they were going to stay in the Union. So Maryland stays in the Union. Now, Kentucky, state that has slavery. There really was some question about whether or not Kentucky was going to join the Confederacy or not. And the Union Army stationed itself just outside of Kentucky. They didn't go marching into Kentucky. They didn't want Kentucky to feel invaded. Now, the Confederate Army, that's what this little block is showing, they did march into Kentucky. And Kentucky felt that they were invaded by the Confederacy and they decided to stay in the Union. They felt like they had been invaded, which is a good thing because it kept the control of the Ohio River to the Union and not to the Confederacy. And it gave the Union Army access to these rivers that would be able to cut right into the heart of the Confederacy. Yeah, neat little animation there. Now, for Missouri, at the Battle of Wilson Creek, it did not go well for the Union. But the Battle of Pea Ridge, March 1862, that pretty much gave control of Missouri to the Union. Although Missouri was, it was a mess through the whole Civil War, and there was lots of, families even that fought against their own families. Missouri definitely had some leanings towards the Confederacy, but they decided to stay in the Union. So there's only one other bit that I got to tell you about when it comes to the states that stayed in the Union. This here, West Virginia. You see, in 1860, 1861, there was no such thing as West Virginia. But after a lot of fighting, through the course of a couple of years worth, the people of West Virginia, on the other side of the mountains from Virginia, that's what these are mountains, the people of West Virginia decided to secede from Virginia and make their own state. And so West Virginia became part of the Union after West Virginia basically left Virginia after Virginia had left the Union. So in 1863, West Virginia became a state. All right, so there's the two sides. Union up north, Confederates down below. You could also call them rebels. Let's commit on to comparing, and let's compare population. There's about 20 million people in the Union. For the Confederacy, there's about 9 million people. But wait, of those 9 million, about 4 million are slaves. Now, it's pretty important to know the population because, well, it's from the population that you'll get your soldiers. A lot more people in the population, a lot more possibility for soldiers. So here, the Confederates were certainly not going to allow their slaves to serve in the army. So the Confederates are vastly outnumbered in population. Manufacturing establishments, making stuff. Soldiers need a lot of stuff: guns, ammunition, uniforms, shoes, all these things that soldiers would need. Manufacturing establishments would make that stuff. So the United States of America, has well over 100, because it's 100 times 1,000, 100,000. That's 110,000 manufacturing establishments. Yeah, the Confederates don't even have 20,000. So, much more ability to make stuff for the Union. Pig iron. Now, that's iron, making things out of iron. Railroad cars, train tracks, cannonballs, cannons. Iron's pretty important when it comes to fighting wars. Like I said earlier, the first iron warships. Now, the Confederates, that's not a lot of iron that they have. Yeah, that's a big big difference. Now, you notice that on these graphs, and an important graph skill is to notice the labels. USA for United States of America, CSA for the Confederate States of America, USA, CSA. CSA, I didn't put anything here. That's because this isn't the USA pig iron. That's just Pennsylvania. That's not even the entire Union. It's only Pennsylvania. The Union has a lot more than that, but I didn't want the graph to be all kinds of huge. I only showed Pennsylvania. Oh my gosh. Warships. You're going to fight a war surrounded by water as the Confederacy is. I mean, warships going to be pretty important. The Union Army, the Union Navy, I should say, because it's Navy, warships. Each one of those ships counts as 10. So if you count the number of ships, multiply it by 10, you can count it up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 ships in the Union Navy. That's a half. 1/2 times 10. That would be 5. Wow. So looking at all of these numbers here, it is not looking great for the Confederacy. It is actually quite impressive that the Confederacy hung on for 4 years. The war started in April of 1861. It doesn't end until April, May of 1865. So for 4 years, the Confederacy hung on and fought pretty well for a while, even though they had so many things going against them. One more thing going against them: railroads. When the railroads, quick movement of supplies, quick movement of soldiers. The Union, a lot more railroads than the Confederacy. And the Confederates have other problems when it comes to their railroads. Let me show you. So here's the railroads going east to west. There's not a lot of them. It's pretty easy to show. And here's the other problem. Can you see right here how the lines aren't connected up? That's because the railroads weren't connected up. If you wanted to get from Vicksburg, if you wanted to get supplies from Vicksburg, Mississippi to Wilmington, North Carolina, it was quite a challenge. They'd be on the railroad, but then they would have to get off the railroad and take it by cart to the river, take a boat across the river, get it back on a cart, take it onto, then it gets onto the railroad. Off the railroad, onto a boat to go along this river, back onto the railroad, and then they would be able to get to North Carolina. Yeah, not exactly an efficient means of moving supplies. Now, there were railroads that traveled from north to south as well, but as you can see, there's not a lot of them. And for the Union, it would be very easy to just kind of slice in and cut the Confederacy's rail network and rail supplies apart. So, last thing, the COA, the course of action. How is the South going to defend itself in this war? So one option is to attack, to go invading into the North. The problem with that is they don't really have the supplies or the people to be able to do that and be able to sustain. So not a great plan for the South to do that. They still did a couple of times. A couple of times they invaded into Maryland and even got as far as Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863. But that's really, actually, the Army actually marched as close to Harrisburg, but they fought a battle at Gettysburg. Anyway, but it didn't really work out. It wasn't going to, that's not going to be a good course of action. Another course of action: passive defense. Let the Union Army come marching in and then attack the supply lines and attack them when you get a chance. Now, that's a good way to fight, and you can sustain that for a while. The problem is it's not very popular with the people because they're getting invaded by the other army. So that doesn't really get your population to support it. The other, an active defense. When the Union armies come marching in, go and meet them and fight against them. This is what the South did most often, was actively defend against the Union Army. Now, the course of action for the North was Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan to surround the South and, like an anaconda snake, squeeze the South to death. So, first part of surrounding the South was to set up a blockade and use their warship advantage to keep the South from getting any supplies from any other countries or moving supplies using the ocean. So, blockade the ports. The next part of the plan is to weird is to take control of the Mississippi River. So, take control of the Mississippi River. The third part is the squeeze part, to have the soldiers invade and squeeze the life out of the rebellion. And that's what they wound up doing. And the question is, was the Anaconda Plan a good plan? Well, the Union winds up winning the Civil War. So I would say that it was a good plan. It did take 4 years in order to win the war, but it did work. So there was three parts of the Anaconda Plan: blockade the ports, take control of the Mississippi River, and then armies invade from the east and west. We'll talk more about battles and that kind of thing in the upcoming lessons, and we'll talk more about why the war was being fought. And yeah, so that's what I got for now. Be sure to answer the questions down below and have fun.